This is not a story about a monster appearing from nowhere. This is not a narrative about evil that could not have been predicted. This is a story about a system that had all the information it needed, all the warnings it required, and still allowed tragedy to unfold exactly as it had been designed to prevent. What happened in Soham in August 2002 was not inevitable because of one man's actions. It was inevitable because multiple institutions, multiple people, multiple systems of protection all failed in sequence, and those failures aligned in the worst possible way. Soham is a small market town in Cambridgeshire, England. In 2002, it had a population of around 9,000 people. It was the kind of place where neighbours knew each other's names, where children walked to school without supervision, where the local primary school sat at the heart of the community. There was a high street with familiar shops, a church that had stood for centuries, and streets where the same families had lived for generations. Nothing about Soham suggested danger. Nothing about its quiet streets, its predictable routines, its sense of shared identity indicated that it would become the center of a national tragedy that would force an entire country to confront the failures of its child protection systems. In places like Soham, trust is not just a social nicety. It is the foundation of daily life. Parents trusted that their children could walk to the local shop. They trusted that the school was a safe environment. They trusted that the people employed to work with children had been properly vetted, properly checked, properly cleared. This trust was not blind, it was based on the assumption that systems existed to verify safety, that institutions communicated with each other, that warning signs would be caught before they became tragedies. But trust, when it is built on broken systems, becomes the most dangerous thing of all. It creates the illusion of safety while the mechanisms meant to guarantee that safety have quietly stopped functioning. The story of Soham is not about the absence of warnings. It is about warnings that existed but were never connected. It is about information that was documented but never shared. It is about procedures that were followed individually but never coordinated collectively. And it is about two 10-year-old girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, whose lives were ended by someone the system already knew posed a risk. Someone who should never have been in a position of trust. Someone who had been allowed to slip through gaps that were wide enough to be visible, but somehow invisible to the institutions responsible for closing them. Before August 2002, Soham operated with the rhythm of routine. The local primary school, Soham Village College, served the community as both an educational institution and a social hub. Parents dropped their children off in the morning with the same casual confidence they had every day before. Teachers prepared lessons, administrative staff managed schedules. The school year had its familiar pattern of terms and holidays, assemblies and sports days, parent evenings and Christmas concerts. It was an institution woven into the fabric of the community, a place where generations had been educated, where trust was not questioned because it had never been betrayed. And among those staff members was a caretaker who had been hired the previous year, someone who lived on the school grounds with his partner, who was herself a teaching assistant at the school. To the parents, to the community, to anyone observing from the outside, this arrangement appeared entirely normal. Background checks had presumably been completed, references had presumably been verified, the systems that were supposed to protect children had presumably done their work. The caretaker was visible around the school. He maintained the buildings. He was seen in the corridors, on the grounds, performing the ordinary tasks that keep an institution functioning. His presence was unremarkable, expected, trusted. But those presumptions were false. The caretaker was Ian Huntley. His partner was Maxine Carr. And by the time they were employed at Soham Village College, Huntley had already accumulated a history that should have disqualified him from any position involving children, Between 1995 and 1999, while living in Grimsby in northeast Lincolnshire, Huntley had been the subject of 9 separate allegations involving sexual contact with minors. These were not minor complaints, these were not misunderstandings. These allegations had been reported to Humberside Police and included accusations of underage sex, indecent assault, and rape. 4 separate young women, some of them teenagers at the time of their contact with Huntley, had come forward to report his behaviour. Investigations had been opened, statements had been taken, records had been created, files had been built documenting a pattern of predatory behaviour that should have raised alarm bells at every level of the system, but no charges were ever filed. In some cases, the young women withdrew their complaints, a pattern common in cases involving sexual violence where victims face pressure, fear, or trauma that makes continuing with formal proceedings unbearable. In other cases, the Crown Prosecution Service determined there was insufficient evidence to proceed to trial, a legal threshold that, while necessary for protecting the innocent, also creates gaps through which the guilty can slip. The investigations were closed, the allegations remained on file with Humberside Police. The pattern remained documented, and Huntley moved on with his life, eventually relocating to Cambridgeshire and applying for a job at Soham Village College. When Soham Village College sought to conduct background checks on Huntley, they followed the procedure that existed at the time. This was not a casual process. Schools took vetting seriously. There were guidelines to follow, forms to complete, checks to request. The school contacted Cambridgeshire Constabulary and requested a police check on Ian Huntley. This was standard practice for anyone working with children. The police would search their records, identify any criminal history, and report back to the employer. It was a system designed to filter out individuals who posed a risk. It was supposed to be the safety net that caught dangerous people before they could access vulnerable populations. Cambridgeshire Constabulary received the request and conducted their search. They examined their own records, looking for any history of criminal activity, any arrests, any convictions, any intelligence that would suggest Ian Huntley was a risk. They found nothing. Huntley had no criminal convictions. He had no record of arrests within Cambridgeshire. He had never come to the attention of local police. The check came back clear. The system had been followed. The procedure had been completed. And Soham Village College received confirmation that, as far as could be determined from official records, Ian Huntley was safe to work with children. He was hired. And no one at Cambridgeshire Constabulary thought to contact Humberside Police to see if records existed there, in the jurisdiction where Huntley had previously lived. The system was not designed to make that connection automatically. It relied on individual initiative, on someone thinking to ask the right question, on an assumption of thoroughness that did not exist in practice. There was no national database. There was no centralized system that would flag intelligence from other regions. Each police force operated independently, managing their own records, responding to requests based on their own information. If an individual moved from one jurisdiction to another, their history did not automatically follow them. It remained in the files of the original police force, invisible to anyone who did not know to look there. This was not a technological problem. The technology existed to share information. This was not about databases that could not communicate. It was about databases that were not required to communicate. This was about institutions that operated in silos, that focused on their own responsibilities without considering the broader picture. Humberside Police had the information. Cambridgeshire Constabulary did not ask for it. Soham Village College assumed the check they received was comprehensive. It was not. And so Ian Huntley, a man who had been accused 9 times of sexual offences against minors, a man whose pattern of behaviour had been documented by multiple victims, a man who should have been flagged as a significant risk to children, became the caretaker of a primary school, living on campus, surrounded by children every day, trusted by parents who had no reason to believe that the systems designed to protect their children had already failed. The warnings were not absent, they were simply invisible to the people who needed to see them. But the failure went deeper than just the police check. Ian Huntley had also provided references as part of his job application. These references were from previous employers, individuals who could vouch for his character and suitability for working with children. On paper, the references appeared satisfactory, but they were not thoroughly verified. The school did not dig deeper into Huntley's employment history. They did not contact every previous employer. They did not ask detailed questions about why he had left previous positions or whether there had been any concerns about his behavior. This was not unusual. Reference checks are often perfunctory, a box to tick on a checklist rather than a genuine investigation. Employers rely on the information provided, assuming that if something serious had occurred, it would have been documented, it would have been flagged, it would have been impossible to miss. But again, the system relied on someone taking initiative, on someone going beyond the minimum requirement, on someone deciding that thoroughness was worth the extra effort. And in most cases, that initiative is not taken, not because people are lazy or uncaring, but because they are busy, because they are following established procedures, because they trust that if something were truly wrong, the formal systems would catch it. They trust that the police check would flag dangerous individuals. They trust that references would not be provided by employers who had concerns. They trust that the various layers of protection are functioning as designed. And when all those layers fail simultaneously, when every assumption turns out to be false, the result is catastrophic. In the weeks and months leading up to August 2002, life in Soham continued with its familiar patterns. The school year ended in July and summer holidays began. Children filled the streets, riding bicycles, playing in parks, enjoying the freedom that summer brings in small towns where parents feel safe letting their children roam. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were best friends, inseparable in the way that 10-year-old girls often are. They had known each other for years. They attended Soham Village College together. They spent time at each other's homes. Their families were close. Holly was the daughter of Kevin and Nicola Wells. Jessica was the daughter of Leslie and Sharon Chapman. Both families were deeply rooted in the community. Both families trusted Soham in the way that everyone who lived there trusted it. Holly and Jessica were typical 10-year-olds. They enjoyed football, particularly Manchester United, and often wore matching football shirts. They had favourite television shows, favourite songs, favourite places to go in town. They were bright, happy children with their whole lives ahead of them. They walked to school together, spent afternoons together, made plans for the future together. Their friendship was the kind that defines childhood, the kind that feels eternal when you are living it, the kind that parents watch with quiet joy because they know how precious those bonds are. On Sunday, August 4th, 2002, the Wells family was hosting a barbecue at their home on Red House Gardens in Soham. It was a warm summer evening, the kind where families gather in gardens, where food is cooked outdoors, where children play while adults relax and enjoy the weather. Jessica Chapman came over to join the barbecue. The two girls spent the afternoon and early evening together, eating, playing, talking, the way best friends do when they have nowhere else to be and nothing else they need to do. The atmosphere was relaxed, comfortable, safe. This was not a special occasion. This was just an ordinary Sunday in Soham, the kind of day that happens countless times every summer in every small town across the country. Around 6:30 in the evening, as the barbecue was winding down, Holly and Jessica asked if they could go for a walk. They wanted to buy sweets from the vending machines at the local sports centre, Ross Piers Sports Centre, which was about a 10-minute walk from the Wells' home. Their parents agreed without hesitation. This was Soham. Children walked around the neighbourhood all the time. The route to the sports centre was straightforward. along streets the girls knew well. There was no reason to worry, no reason to say no, no reason to think this request was any different from the dozens of similar requests their parents had granted before. Holly and Jessica left the house wearing matching red Manchester United football shirts. Holly wore number 7, the number worn by David Beckham. Jessica wore number 9. They walked down Red House Gardens, turned onto Sand Street, heading toward the centre of town. They were seen by neighbours, by other families enjoying the summer evening. They appeared exactly as they were, two friends on a routine errand in a familiar place. No one saw anything unusual, no one had any reason to pay particular attention. It was an ordinary moment in an ordinary evening. They were never seen alive again. The last confirmed sighting of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman alive was captured on CCTV at the Ross Piers Sports Centre at approximately 6:53 in the evening. The footage shows two girls in red football shirts walking near the Sports Centre building. The image is grainy, the kind of low-quality security camera footage that is common in small community facilities, but the girls are identifiable. They appear relaxed, walking together, talking. There is nothing in their body language that suggests distress or concern. They are simply two children going about their evening, unaware that they are being watched by a camera, unaware that this footage will become one of the most analysed pieces of evidence in a case that will soon dominate national headlines. What happened in the next hour remains partially reconstructed from evidence, testimony, and investigation, but the timeline is clear. At some point after leaving the sports centre, Holly and Jessica encountered Ian Huntley. The exact circumstances of this encounter have been disputed, but the outcome was not. Huntley lured the girls into the house he shared with Maxine Carr on the grounds of Soham Village College. The house was at 5 College Close, a semi-detached property that came with Huntley's position as caretaker. It was located on the school campus, a place the girls would have recognized, a place that would not have seemed threatening. Maxine Carr, who was a teaching assistant and whom the girls knew from school, was not at home that evening. She was visiting family in Grimsby. But Huntley told the girls that Carr was upstairs, creating a reason for them to enter the house. Once inside, Ian Huntley murdered both girls. The exact method and sequence has been subject to legal testimony and forensic analysis, but the core fact is undisputed. Within a short period of time, both Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were dead, and Ian Huntley, now faced with the reality of what he had done, began a process of concealment that would occupy the rest of that night and the early hours of the following morning. Huntley placed the bodies of both girls in his car, a red Ford Fiesta. He drove approximately 10 miles to a remote location near RAF Lakenheath, a Royal Air Force station in Suffolk. The area he chose was isolated, accessible by rough track, surrounded by fields and agricultural land. It was the kind of place where someone could work unobserved, where evidence could be hidden, where discovery was unlikely. Huntley removed the bodies from the car and placed them in a ditch beside a track. He attempted to destroy evidence by cutting the girls' clothing and setting fire to their bodies. The fire did not completely consume the remains, but it was sufficient to cause severe damage, to obscure forensic evidence, to make identification more difficult. After hiding the bodies, Huntley returned to Soham. He cleaned his house, attempting to remove any trace of what had occurred. He disposed of evidence. He created a story that would explain his contact with the girls without implicating him in their disappearance. And then he waited, knowing that when the girls did not return home, their parents would begin searching, the police would be called, and questions would be asked. At first, the absence of Holly and Jessica did not register as an emergency. When the girls did not return from their walk by the expected time, their parents assumed they had been delayed, that they had run into other friends, that they were simply taking longer than anticipated. But as the evening stretched into night, concern grew into alarm. Kevin and Nicola Wells began searching the neighborhood, walking the route to the sports center, checking the places they knew their daughter frequented. Sharon and Leslie Chapman did the same. They called friends, asking if anyone had seen the girls. They knocked on doors. They walked through the streets, calling their daughters' names. By late evening, the concern had escalated to genuine fear. The girls had been gone for hours. It was now dark. They had not contacted their parents. This was not normal behavior. Holly and Jessica were responsible children. They would not have stayed out this late without calling. They would not have worried their parents intentionally. Something was wrong. Shortly before 11 o'clock that night, Cambridgeshire Constabulary was notified that Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were missing. The police response was immediate and extensive. Officers were dispatched to Soham within minutes. They began searching the area around the town, focusing on the route between Red House Gardens and the sports centre. They interviewed neighbours, asking if anyone had seen the girls. They checked the sports centre itself, examining the vending machines the girls had intended to visit, looking for any sign of where they might have gone. Initial inquiries were conducted with the calm efficiency of officers who hoped this would be resolved quickly, that the girls would be found safe, that there would be a simple explanation. But as the hours passed and no trace of Holly or Jessica was found, the nature of the investigation changed. By early morning on Monday, August 5th, neighbouring police forces had been alerted. Suffolk Constabulary, Norfolk Constabulary and other regional forces were asked to assist. The media was contacted. By Monday morning, the disappearance of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman was national news. Photographs of the two girls smiling in their school uniforms appeared on television broadcasts and in newspapers. The story spread rapidly. Two 10-year-old girls, best friends, had vanished from a quiet town in broad daylight. There were no witnesses to an abduction. There were no reports of suspicious vehicles. There was no ransom demand. There was simply an absence where there should have been presence, a void that grew more terrifying with every passing hour. Search teams were organized with military precision. Police officers, search and rescue teams, and volunteers from the community joined the effort. The search area expanded beyond Soham, covering fields, woods, waterways, and abandoned buildings across Cambridgeshire and into neighbouring counties. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the surrounding countryside, looking for any sign of the missing girls. Police divers searched local rivers, ponds, and drainage ditches. Specially trained dogs were brought in to track scents. The entire apparatus of a major investigation was activated, and at the centre of that effort was a community that could not comprehend what was happening. Soham was not the kind of place where children disappeared. It was not the kind of place where parents had to fear for their children's safety. The town had no history of abductions, no reputation for danger, no reason to believe that anything terrible could happen there. And yet two girls were gone, and no one knew where. The psychological impact on the community was immediate and profound. Parents kept their children indoors. Neighbours watched strangers with suspicion. The sense of security that had defined Soham for generations evaporated in a matter of hours, replaced by fear, confusion, and a desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, Holly and Jessica would be found alive. Among the volunteers who joined the search effort was Ian Huntley. He appeared at the school on Monday morning, offering to help coordinate the search from the school grounds. He spoke to police officers, providing information about the layout of the school, the surrounding area, the places where children in Soham typically played. He gave interviews to the media, expressing concern for the missing girls and describing himself as one of the last people to see them. In one interview that would later become infamous, Huntley stood outside his house and told reporters that Holly and Jessica had walked past his home on Sunday evening. He said they had stopped briefly to ask about Maxine Carr, his partner, who was a teaching assistant the girls knew from school. He described a short, innocent conversation and then watched them walk away toward the town centre, presumably toward the sports centre. Huntley's demeanour was calm, helpful, concerned. He appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a member of the school staff who was worried about two missing students and wanted to do whatever he could to help find them. He participated in search efforts. He distributed missing person posters. He spoke to neighbours and journalists. And because he was a member of the school staff, because he was someone the community recognised, because he had inserted himself into the search effort in a way that appeared natural and helpful, no one questioned his presence. No one thought to investigate him more closely. No one had any reason to suspect that the man helping to search for Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman was the same man who had killed them. This pattern of behaviour, where a perpetrator inserts themselves into the investigation or search effort for their victim, is well documented in criminal psychology. It serves multiple purposes. It allows the perpetrator to monitor the progress of the investigation, to gauge how close authorities are to discovering the truth. It provides a veneer of innocence, a public display of concern that deflects suspicion. And it satisfies a psychological need for control, for remaining connected to the crime even as efforts to solve it intensify. But in the moment, when a community is desperate for answers and mobilizing every available resource, these behaviors do not register as suspicious. They register as helpful. The search continued for days. Media coverage intensified. The faces of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman appeared on every news broadcast, in every newspaper, on posters in every town across the country. The story dominated the national conversation. People who had never been to Soham, who had no connection to the families, followed the case with obsessive attention, hoping for a miracle, praying for the girls to be found safe. Vigils were held, tributes were created. The entire country seemed to hold its breath, waiting for news. Kevin and Nicola Wells, Sharon and Leslie Chapman made public appeals, begging for information, pleading with anyone who might know anything to come forward. Their anguish was visible, raw, unbearable to witness. They clung to hope because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. They believed that somewhere, somehow, their daughters were still alive, that this nightmare would end with a reunion, that the systems and people working to find Holly and Jessica would succeed. But 13 days after the girls disappeared, that hope was extinguished. On Saturday, August 17th, 2002, a gamekeeper working near RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk discovered human remains in a ditch beside a track in an area known as Warren Hill. The remains were severely burned and partially decomposed, but forensic examination quickly confirmed what everyone feared. The bodies were those of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. They had been dead since the night they disappeared. Every hour of searching, every appeal for information, every desperate hope had been in vain. The girls had been gone before the search even began. The discovery transformed the investigation overnight. What had been a search for missing children became a murder inquiry. The focus shifted from finding Holly and Jessica to finding who had killed them and why. And almost immediately, attention turned to Ian Huntley. Investigators had always maintained a list of people who had reported seeing or interacting with the girls on the evening of August the 4th. Huntley was on that list because he had voluntarily come forward to say the girls had walked past his house. But now, with the knowledge that this was a murder investigation, that initial statement took on new significance. Police began to examine Huntley's account more closely. They found inconsistencies. His timeline did not quite match other witness statements. His description of where the girls had gone after leaving his house did not align with the CCTV footage and other evidence, and when investigators started to dig into his background, when they began asking questions about his history, red flags began to appear. But the most damning evidence came from forensic examination of Huntley's house and car. Despite his efforts to clean the scene, traces remained. Forensic scientists found evidence that placed Holly and Jessica inside Huntley's house at 5 College Close. Fibers from their clothing were found in his home. Biological evidence linked the girls to his car. The forensic picture was damning and irrefutable. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman had been inside Ian Huntley's house. They had been inside his car. And the only explanation for that fact, combined with the discovery of their bodies, was that Huntley had killed them. Ian Huntley was arrested on August 17, 2002, the same day the bodies were found. He was taken into custody on suspicion of murder. Maxine Carr was arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. The arrests sent shockwaves through Soham and across the nation. The caretaker, the man who had helped with the search, the man who had given interviews expressing concern, the man who had stood in front of cameras and told the country he had spoken to the girls and watched them walk away, safe, was the person responsible for their deaths. The betrayal felt by the community was absolute. Parents who had trusted the school, who had trusted that their children were safe in an environment overseen by vetted staff, now had to confront the reality that the man responsible for maintaining that environment had murdered 2 children. The trust that had been the foundation of Soham's social fabric was shattered. The sense of security that had allowed children to walk freely through the town was gone, and the questions began immediately. How had this happened? How had Ian Huntley been allowed into that position? What had gone wrong? As police investigated, the full extent of the systemic failure began to emerge. Detectives contacted Humberside Police, asking if they had any information on Ian Huntley. The response was devastating. Humberside Police revealed that Huntley had been the subject of 9 separate allegations of sexual offences involving minors between 1995 and 1999. 9 allegations, 9 separate instances where young women had come forward to report predatory behaviour. 9 times when the system had been given information that should have prevented Huntley from ever working with children. But those allegations had never resulted in charges, and because they had never resulted in charges, they had not appeared on the basic police check conducted by Cambridgeshire Constabulary when Soham Village College requested vetting. The information existed, but it was not accessible through the standard procedure. It was held in intelligence files, in records that were not automatically shared between police forces, in systems that operated independently, and, critically, some of those records had been deleted. Humberside Police, like many police forces at the time, had policies for managing intelligence records. These policies were designed in part to protect individuals who had been accused but never convicted of crimes, to prevent unsubstantiated allegations from following someone for their entire life. Records were periodically reviewed, and if no charges had been filed, if no further evidence had emerged, those records could be deleted to free up storage space and to comply with data protection principles. In Huntley's case, some of the intelligence about his alleged offences had been purged from active databases. The information had existed, but it no longer existed in a form that could be easily accessed or shared. This revelation sparked outrage. How could a system designed to protect children have deleted information about someone with multiple allegations of sexual offences against minors? How could the principle of data protection be prioritized over the principle of child safety? How could police forces operate in silos, failing to share intelligence that could save lives? These questions demanded answers, and the government ordered a formal inquiry to examine what had gone wrong. But first, there was a trial. Ian Huntley was charged with 2 counts of murder. Maxine Carr was charged with conspiring to pervert the course of justice and assisting an offender. The trial began on November 5, 2003 at the Old Bailey in London. It lasted 7 weeks and was one of the most closely watched criminal trials in British history. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case. Forensic evidence placed Holly and Jessica in Huntley's house and car. Witness testimony established a timeline that contradicted Huntley's initial statements. Phone records showed that Huntley had made calls to Maxine Carr shortly after the murders, calls in which he had allegedly told her what had happened and asked her to provide him with an alibi. And Carr had done exactly that. When police first questioned her, she had told them she was at home with Huntley on the evening of August 4th, that she had been there when the girls walked past, that she had seen them from the window. It was a lie. Carr had been in Grimsby that evening, visiting family. Her false statement was an attempt to support Huntley's story, to make it appear that there were 2 witnesses to the girls walking safely away from the house, to deflect suspicion from Huntley. Huntley's defense attempted to argue that the deaths had been accidental, that the girls had died as a result of a tragic mishap rather than deliberate murder. But the forensic evidence, the attempts at concealment, the lies told to police, and the disposal of the bodies all contradicted that narrative. The jury was not persuaded. On December 17, 2003, after deliberating for approximately 1 day, the jury returned their verdict. Ian Huntley was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. The families of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman wept. The nation, which had followed the case for more than a year, felt a collective sense of justice, tempered by the knowledge that no verdict could bring the girls back. Huntley was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 40 years before being considered for parole. The judge described the murders as crimes of exceptional gravity, noting that Huntley had shown no genuine remorse and had attempted to manipulate the investigation through lies and deception. Maxine Carr was found guilty of conspiring to pervert the course of justice and was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. She was later released and given a new identity due to concerns about public hostility. But the conviction of Ian Huntley did not close the case in the broader sense. It did not answer the systemic questions that had emerged during the investigation. How had he been allowed into a position of trust? How had 9 allegations failed to prevent his employment? How had the vetting system failed so completely? These questions demanded a thorough examination, and in 2003 the government appointed Sir Michael Bishard to lead an independent inquiry into the circumstances surrounding Huntley's employment at Soham Village College. The Bishard inquiry was comprehensive and unsparing. It examined the vetting procedures used by Soham Village College, the police checks conducted by Cambridgeshire Constabulary, the intelligence held by Humberside Police, and the broader systemic issues that had allowed Huntley to slip through multiple layers of protection. The inquiry heard evidence from police officers, school administrators, social workers, and child protection experts. It reviewed policies, procedures, and records. And its findings, published in June 2004, were damning. The inquiry found that Humberside Police had failed to properly record and manage the intelligence they held on Huntley. Allegations had been logged in various systems, but those systems did not communicate with each other effectively. Some allegations were recorded in one database, but not in others. Some records had been deleted as part of routine data management, eliminating crucial information that should have been retained. When Cambridgeshire Constabulary requested a background check, the fragmented and incomplete nature of Humberside's records meant that the full picture of Huntley's history was not visible. The inquiry also found that the vetting procedures for individuals working with children were inconsistent across different regions and institutions. There was no national standard. There was no centralized database that employers could access to check the backgrounds of potential employees. Each police force managed its own records. Each school or institution interpreted vetting guidance in its own way. The result was a patchwork system full of gaps, a system where someone like Huntley could move from one jurisdiction to another and effectively reset their history. Sir Michael Bishard's report made several key recommendations. He called for the creation of a national registration scheme for people working with children and vulnerable adults, a centralized system that would track individuals across jurisdictions and maintain comprehensive records of allegations, investigations, and convictions. He called for improved information sharing between police forces, with clear protocols for how intelligence should be recorded, retained, and shared when vetting checks were requested. He called for a standardized vetting process that would be consistent across all regions and all types of institutions working with children. And he called for a cultural shift within police forces and other agencies, a recognition that child protection must be the absolute priority, overriding concerns about data protection, administrative convenience, or resource constraints. The government accepted the inquiry's recommendations and began implementing reforms. In 2006, the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act was passed, creating the Independent Safeguarding Authority, which later merged with the Criminal Records Bureau to form the Disclosure and Barring Service. This new system centralized background checks and created a single database that employers across the country could access. The vetting process was strengthened to include not just criminal convictions, but also relevant police intelligence, allegations that had not led to prosecution, and information from other agencies, such as social services. The reforms represented a significant improvement over the system that had existed in 2002. The creation of a central database meant that individuals could no longer escape their history by moving to a different region. Police forces were required to share intelligence more systematically, and the checks conducted for employment in schools and other child-related settings became more thorough and more comprehensive. The reforms were a direct response to the failures identified in the Bishard inquiry, an attempt to ensure that what happened in Soham could never happen again. But even as these reforms were implemented, questions remained about whether they went far enough. The new system was more comprehensive, but it was also more complex. It required institutions to navigate additional bureaucracy, and there were concerns about whether smaller organizations, such as volunteer groups or small charities, would have the resources and knowledge to comply fully. There were also ongoing debates about the balance between protecting children and respecting the rights of individuals who had been accused but never convicted of crimes. The tension between these priorities had been at the heart of the failures in Huntley's case, where intelligence about allegations had been deleted to protect his privacy and data rights, even though those allegations indicated a pattern of predatory behavior. More troubling was the realization that the reforms addressed the specific failures that had occurred in Soham, but could not guarantee that other types of failures would not emerge. Systems are only as effective as the people operating them. Databases can be created, but they must be used properly. Information must be entered accurately, searched thoroughly, and interpreted correctly. Procedures can be standardized, but they must be followed consistently, without shortcuts or assumptions, and institutions must accept accountability when they fail, not deflect responsibility or claim that they followed the letter of the procedure even when the spirit of protection was ignored. In the years since Soham, there have been other cases that have tested the reformed system. There have been instances where individuals with concerning histories have been employed in positions of trust, where warning signs have been missed, where communication between agencies has broken down. Each of these cases has prompted reviews, adjustments, and promises to do better. But the fundamental challenge remains. Child protection depends on systems working perfectly every time, without exception, and systems operated by human beings, subject to resource constraints, time pressures, and competing priorities, are never perfect. The families of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman have lived with the consequences of these failures every day since August 2002. Kevin and Nicola Wells, Sharon and Leslie Chapman, have had to navigate grief compounded by the knowledge that the tragedy was preventable. They have had to watch as inquiries and trials and reforms have unfolded, knowing that none of it will bring their daughters back. They have had to endure the public nature of their loss, the constant media attention, the endless reminders of what was taken from them. And they have shown extraordinary courage in continuing to speak about the need for vigilance, for accountability, for a commitment to child protection that goes beyond policy documents and procedural guidelines. Their voices have been a constant reminder that behind every systemic failure are real people, real families, real lives destroyed by decisions that should have been made differently. Holly and Jessica were not statistics. They were not abstract victims in a theoretical discussion about policy reform. They were children with personalities, with dreams, with futures that should have stretched out before them for decades. They were daughters, friends, students, individuals with value and potential that was erased by failures that were entirely preventable. Soham is still a small town in Cambridgeshire. The primary school still operates, though it has been renamed and rebuilt. Children still walk through the streets on summer evenings. Families still gather for barbecues. Life continues because it must. But the memory of what happened in August 2002 remains. It remains in the conversations parents have about safety, in the heightened awareness of where children are and who they are with. It remains in the procedures schools follow when hiring staff, the checks that are now more thorough, the questions that are now asked more carefully. It remains in the national consciousness as a symbol of what can happen when systems fail, when trust is misplaced, when the mechanisms designed to protect the vulnerable break down at the moment they are needed most. And it remains as a question that has never been fully answered, a question that haunts every discussion of child protection, every review of vetting procedures, every case where warning signs appear but are not acted upon. How much failure is acceptable before we say the system itself is broken? Because the truth about Soham is not that it was unique. The truth is not that it represented an anomaly, a one-in-a-million confluence of circumstances that could never be repeated. The truth is that it was predictable. Ian Huntley's history was known. His pattern of behavior was documented. The information existed that could have prevented him from being hired at Soham Village College. The system had the tools it needed to protect Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. It had the intelligence, the records, the allegations, the pattern of predatory behavior, and it did not use them. Not because of a single catastrophic error that can be identified and corrected. Not because of one person who failed to do their job, but because of a series of smaller failures that accumulated into something catastrophic. Because police forces did not communicate across jurisdictions. Because data protection policies prioritized the privacy of accused individuals over the safety of potential victims. Because vetting procedures were followed in a perfunctory way without genuine investigation. Because references were accepted without verification. Because everyone assumed that someone else was handling the bigger picture, that their small part of the process was sufficient, that the system as a whole was functioning even when their individual piece was not, and those smaller failures, those gaps in communication, those assumptions that someone else was taking responsibility, those decisions to prioritize administrative convenience over thoroughness, those are not unique to Soham. They are present in systems everywhere, waiting for the circumstances to align in the worst possible way. They are present in schools and hospitals, in social services and youth organizations, in every institution that works with vulnerable populations. They are present because systems are complex, because resources are limited, because people are busy and procedures are numerous. And it is always tempting to assume that if something were truly wrong, someone else would catch it. The reforms implemented after Soham were necessary and important. The creation of the disclosure and barring service, the centralization of vetting procedures, the improved information sharing between police forces, all of these were steps in the right direction. They closed specific gaps that had allowed Ian Huntley to slip through. They made it harder for individuals with concerning histories to move between jurisdictions and reset their records. They created mechanisms for better coordination and communication, but they were reactive, not proactive. They addressed the failures that had already occurred rather than anticipating the failures that might occur in the future. And they were implemented in a context where resources are finite, where institutions are under constant pressure to do more with less, where the temptation to take shortcuts is always present. The disclosure and barring service check is more comprehensive than what existed in 2002, but it is also more expensive and time-consuming. Organizations must wait longer to hire staff. They must navigate more complex procedures. And in that complexity, there is always the risk that corners will be cut, that someone will decide a check is taking too long and hire someone provisionally, that urgency will override caution, that the same patterns of failure will re-emerge in new forms. The question is not whether the system is better than it was in 2002. It is. The question is whether it is good enough. And the uncomfortable answer is that we will not know until it is tested again, until someone with a history of concerning behavior applies for a position working with children. Until information about that history exists in records somewhere, and until we see whether the improved systems catch that information, connect it properly, and make the right decision. Because child protection is not a problem that can be solved once and then forgotten. It is not a box that can be ticked and then ignored. It requires constant vigilance, constant attention, constant commitment. It requires institutions that are willing to communicate even when it is inconvenient, even when it requires extra work, even when it means delays and complications. It requires individuals who are willing to ask difficult questions, even when those questions slow down processes, even when they create friction, even when the easy path would be to accept the information provided and move on. It requires a culture that places the safety of children above every other consideration, including institutional reputation, administrative efficiency, budgetary constraints, and the comfort of adults. It requires a willingness to acknowledge when systems fail and to hold those responsible accountable, not just with words, but with meaningful consequences. It requires transparency about failures rather than defensiveness, learning rather than excuse-making, genuine change rather than cosmetic adjustments. Soham did not happen because evil is unpredictable or because danger appears without warning. It happened because the systems designed to predict and prevent that danger did not function. Ian Huntley was not an unknown threat. He was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere. He was a documented risk that was allowed to become a reality. Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman did not die because their parents failed to protect them. They died because the institutions entrusted with their safety failed to perform the most basic function of those institutions, keeping dangerous people away from vulnerable children. And that failure was not inevitable, it was the result of choices. Choices about how information is recorded and for how long. Choices about whether police forces communicate across jurisdictions or operate in isolation. Choices about how thoroughly background checks are conducted. Choices about whether to prioritize speed or thoroughness when hiring staff. Choices about whether to ask one more question or accept the answer already provided. Choices made by individuals who believed they were following procedures, who believed someone else was responsible for the bigger picture, who believed the system was working because they had done their part without ever checking whether their part connected to anyone else's. And those choices, repeated across multiple institutions over several years, created the conditions in which two 10-year-old girls in red football shirts could walk down a familiar street in a safe town, encounter someone the system already knew was dangerous, and never come home. The warning that Soham offers is not complicated. It is not about sophisticated technology or complex policy frameworks. It is about the simple, fundamental requirement that systems must work as they are designed to work, that information must be shared when it needs to be shared, that the protection of children must be the priority that overrides every other consideration. When those requirements are not met, when institutions fail to communicate, when procedures are followed in isolation without coordination, when warnings are documented but not acted upon, tragedy becomes not just possible but probable. By the time Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman were reported missing in Soham, the failure had already happened. It had happened years earlier when allegations against Ian Huntley were investigated but not charged, documented but later deleted, known but not shared. It had happened when background checks were requested but not expanded, when references were accepted without deeper inquiry, when procedures were followed in letter but not in spirit. It happened in every moment when someone could have asked one more question, could have made one more phone call, could have insisted on one more verification, and chose not to because it seemed unnecessary, because it seemed like someone else's responsibility, because the procedure they were following did not explicitly require it. And it happened again in the days after the girls disappeared, when Ian Huntley inserted himself into the search effort, and no one questioned why a man with his history was so eager to help, because no one knew he had that history, because the systems that could have revealed it had already failed. The search felt organized, the response felt thorough, the community felt supported. What no one knew was that the threat was already inside the perimeter, wearing the face of a concerned neighbor, hiding behind the trust that had been granted to him by a system that had stopped functioning long before he ever set foot in Soham. Soham did not just expose a killer, it exposed a system that could not see itself, that could not recognize its own failures until those failures had already cost lives. It revealed institutions that operated in silos, that assumed others were filling the gaps they left, that trusted in procedures without verifying outcomes. And it forced a reckoning that was long overdue, a recognition that child protection is not about good intentions or well-meaning policies, but about systems that actually work, that actually connect, that actually stop dangerous people before they can cause harm. The reforms that followed were important, but they were not a conclusion. They were a beginning, a recognition that the work of protecting children is never finished, that vigilance must be constant, that the price of failure is too high to accept complacency. The question that remains is whether that recognition will endure, whether the urgency felt in the aftermath of Soham will persist as the years pass and the memory fades, whether institutions will continue to prioritize thoroughness over convenience, communication over isolation, accountability over self-protection. Because the next failure is not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. Systems will always have gaps. Human beings will always make mistakes. But the difference between a near miss and a tragedy is whether those gaps and mistakes are caught in time, whether someone asks the question that needs to be asked, whether information is shared when it needs to be shared, whether the warning signs are visible to the people who need to see them. Soham became a warning, not because it was unique, but because it was not. Not because it revealed a problem no one had anticipated, but because it revealed problems everyone should have seen coming. Not because it showed that evil exists, but because it showed that systems designed to stop evil can fail in ways that are predictable, preventable, and inexcusable. The memory of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman deserves more than reforms. It deserves a commitment that their deaths will never be repeated, that no other family will have to endure what theirs have endured, that the failures that allowed Ian Huntley to harm them will not be allowed to harm anyone else. That commitment requires more than policy documents and procedural changes. It requires a culture of vigilance, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, an insistence that the protection of children is not a bureaucratic function, but a moral imperative that demands our constant, unwavering attention. How many failures are acceptable before we say the system is broken? How many warnings can be ignored before we acknowledge that ignoring warnings is the system? How many times can institutions claim they followed procedures while children die before we recognize that procedures are not enough? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that Soham forces us to answer, and the only acceptable answer is zero. Zero acceptable failures, zero ignored warnings, zero children whose safety is sacrificed because a system could not be bothered to connect the information it already possessed. That is the standard Soham demands. That is the lesson its tragedy teaches. And that is the responsibility we carry if we claim to have learned anything from what happened in a small town in Cambridgeshire in August 2002, when two girls in red football shirts walked down a familiar street and encountered a danger the system had already documented but had failed to stop. The failure had already happened. The only question now is whether we will allow it to happen again.